So today we're going to be talking about raptors in southern New Mexico, like Megan just said. So let's go ahead and get started. A little bit more about my experience with raptors. I also did some biological consulting work between graduating from A&M and starting as a professional guide. And during that time, I did surveys for golden eagles and I did Aplomado falcon monitoring in South Texas. But that being said, I'm far from a raptor expert. I'm just here to provide some basic information and things that I think would be useful for you guys out in the field looking for raptors. And if you want to get in contact with me, you can find me on Facebook or on Instagram, or if you need my email, I'm sure we could provide that as well. So today's presentation, we're going to go over a little bit about migration of raptors, some raptor basics as far as tools we use to identify raptors. Then we're going to go over species identification, so give a little species profile for the many different species that can be found in southern New Mexico. And then I will talk about how to go about finding raptors successfully. So a little bit about migration. Raptors can't really be categorized under one nice little umbrella as when it comes to migration. Each species uses a different technique, and all of the raptors in southern New Mexico seem to have different strategies. So some species are what we call partial migrants, and as the illustration here on the right that I got from the Cornell Lab website shows, the golden eagles are, in some populations, highly migratory, and some populations are resident year-round. So that's what we would define as a partial migrant or a partially migratory species. Other species, like the Swainson hawk here, is highly migratory, or what we would call a total migrant, spending its winter, the winter months in northern Argentina and moving back up for the breeding season in the Great Plains. So totally different strategies, totally different birds. And so just kind of an illustration of the diversity of migration strategies. We also have species that are altitudinal migrants, so ones that move up and down the mountains depending on the time of year. And they might do that for food availability reasons. So whether it's the heat of summer or the dead of winter, prey items may become dormant for long periods of time. So to have available prey, certain raptors may move up and down the mountains to find better weather. A great example of that would be prairie falcons. They're really well known for that behavior. And they're also well known for being highly nomadic. So this means that they don't necessarily follow traditional migration routes. Prairie falcons, in fact, will oftentimes go north after breeding instead of going south and wander around for a while. And even on the wintering grounds, at least in my own personal experience with them wintering in South Texas, they seem to almost have no sort of home range at times. They just kind of wander wherever the food is easy and available. And as far as when species are actually moving, they will really tap into weather patterns and use it to their advantage. So right now, raptors are moving south for the winter generally, and you'll often see large movements of raptors when there's a nice tailwind. So broad-winged hawks, Swainson's hawks, things like that will wait for a cold front to come down and kind of push them along on their way south. They'll also migrate along ridge lines. So here in the western US, we have the Rocky Mountains running north to south. And these kind of provide this sort of updraft of wind when we have easterly or westerly winds that provide a lot of lift for raptors to get up and move a lot easier with a lot less energy. just so they're being efficient in their movement. So ridge tops are a great place during migration to sit and watch for raptors moving overhead. But there are other species, like the peregrine falcon, that uses powered flight for migration, meaning it flaps its wings and makes its way. So it really doesn't care which way the wind is blowing because it's going to be moving regardless. So great diversity in migration strategies. And that can be useful for useful knowledge for when you're going out and trying to find raptors. So now getting into the basics, the basic tools we use for identifying raptors. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to group raptors into 4 general categories: falcons, accipiters, buteos, and eagles, etc. So there's a few kind of oddball species that don't really fit nicely into any of these categories, but I kind of threw them in at the end. And we'll get into more details about each of these. And let me just change to the laser pointer here. So any of these photos that you see with a name underneath them are not my photos, but the rest of them are my own photos, just so you don't think I'm not giving someone credit here. So if you've ever opened a raptor book or been to other presentations about raptors, you've probably seen diagrams very similar to this. And it's because it's very important to understand the general shapes of the different categories of raptors, and even species within these categories. So starting at the top left, we have the buteos with pretty broad, strong wings, relatively large heads, just kind of stocky, large hawks. Up next, we have eagles with long, straight wings, relatively small heads, and really powerful bodies. Next, we have harriers with nice long, narrow wings, long, narrow tail. Accipiters with relatively short, rounded wings with small heads, again with long tails. Falcons, which are very sleek, very streamlined, long tails. The osprey, which is kind of an oddball, holds its wings in this sort of M pattern with long, narrow wings. And the turkey vulture with big, broad, strong wings, tiny, tiny head, and sort of this wedge-shaped tail. Some terminology about sort of the geography, I suppose, of raptors. You have the top side, the underside, the leading edge of the wing, this front edge here, and the trailing edge. So these are going to be important terms that are thrown around when we're talking about what we're looking at as far as important details for identifying raptors. And here we have the primary flight feathers, the secondaries, the undertail, which is kind of this region between the tail and the legs, leggings, which are present on some species, which are feathered legs all the way down to the top of the toes, the patagium, which is this region between the wrist and the body, just this front, the leading edge of the wing between the wrist and the body. On this perched bird, we can see the throat, the chest, the breast, kind of standard parts of any bird. Here we see a belly band, which is kind of a band of streaking across the lower belly, which is an important field mark sometimes. Tarsus on this one, which is a leg unfeathered. And in here we can see the tip of the tail and the tip of the wings, and where these wings fall in relation to the tail can be important for identifying perched birds, and the scapulars, which are sometimes a good mark for birds depending on what color they are there. And if you're really lucky and you get a nice up close view like this, you can see the flesh around the bill called the cere, the iris, which the color of the iris can be useful for aging or sexing raptors, the auriculars or the cheeks, the malar region or mustachial region, the orbital ridge, which kind of gives them this really stern appearance, and the gape, which is this fleshy bit that comes back from the bill. And so now we're going to get into the longest section of the talk, which is the species profiles. So we're going to start and kind of keep it broken down by the groups that I initially mentioned. So we're going to start with the falcons and kind of work our way smallest to largest. So our smallest falcon, the American kestrel, is our most common falcon, often found in open areas, either in grasslands or open areas of forest. Really beautiful, really colorful, very striking. And an interesting thing about American kestrels is they are one of the few raptors in the US that is dimorphic or dichromatic, meaning that the males and females are different, have different plumages, and you can easily tell them apart. They are the smallest falcons in the US, so very dainty, not very strong flyers, kind of wobbly in flight, a little erratic. And so here's some other photos giving you some more angles and some more plumages of kestrels. Here's a nice adult female here, streaking all over the breast, nice brown wing with black barring, and notice how petite the bill is. And compare that to an adult male over here with a nice clean breast, nice orange color across that, variable amounts of spotting, really beautiful steely blue wings, and these really bold black facial markings on the male and the female, in front of the eye, behind the eye, on the back of the head. In flight, you see a nice long tail with a black terminal band on the male versus faint banding on the female with streaking across the breast. And this amazing photo that I wish was mine of the top side of the male in flight with just those incredibly gorgeous wings. Up next, a little bit larger, is the merlin, a highly variable species with several subspecies. Compared to the kestrel, it has a much more muddied facial pattern, a pretty bold eyebrow, and in general, they're going to have a cooler grayish tone above on the top side and warm brown streaking on the underside. And on the tail, you will have pretty bold black and white barring. They're fairly uncommon, but prefer open areas like grasslands and prairies. A lot stronger of a flyer than the kestrel, more certain with its movements. And here we see probably the most common plumage of kestrel. This would be the taiga subspecies, very heavily marked below, dark above. Look at this guy in flight. Really bold bands on the tail, lots of streaking and spotting below, very unclear facial pattern. And down here at the bottom right, we have a paler version. This would be the prairie subspecies of merlin with this nice pale blue-gray on the back and paler brown streaking on the breast. Occasionally you'll see some that have more of a tan back, but you can definitely tell them apart from female kestrels by the facial pattern and also flight style from a distance. Our third falcon is the prairie falcon, a lot larger and stronger and more robust of a falcon than the past two. Consistently warm brown tones all around. Nice bold line coming down below the eye, one single line, and a white spot behind the eye. Very strong, powerful flyer. Prefers open habitats like nice, pristine grasslands. Occasionally, they will use open areas of agriculture, but they really avoid any sort of human disturbance. You pretty much never see them in town or around urban areas. And even when I experience them in the field, I find that they're one of the most jumpy species of raptor, incredibly difficult to approach closely and see fine detail on. I got lucky with this guy, he flew right at me. But one of the really key identification points for prairie falcon are these dark armpits or axillary feathers. They can be seen from, when they're a tiny dot soaring way up above you, you can still see those dark armpits really clearly. Like this guy right here. Look at those dark armpits, super obvious. And nice, long, broad, pointed wings. You can tell bigger body, much stronger, more powerful bird than the past two falcons. Variable amounts of spotting and streaking on the breast, depending on age and sex. but consistently warm brown colors overall. And our last falcon is the peregrine, mostly seen in migration in southern New Mexico. They have this really clear, bold black, what we call a helmet pattern on the head and face. Pale below, darker above, and adults have barring and juveniles have streaking. They're a generalist as far as habitat goes. You can see them in the city and around water, around the desert, wherever. They'll take it all. They're pretty robust, not much phases of peregrine. And here's a great comparison between an adult with barring, and a juvenile with streaking. So a quick definition between barring and streaking. Barring goes from left to right across the bird. Streaking goes up and down the bird. So nice streaking on this juvenile, barring on the adult. You can see that clear helmet even from below, even on the juveniles. All right, our next category are the accipiters. So again, going smallest to largest, Sharpshin Hawk, Cooper's Hawk, and Northern Goshawk. So Sharpshin Hawk, very tiny raptor, about the size of a jay or so. And they have, like we were mentioning before with accipiters, really rounded wings, small head. When soaring, they almost can look headless at times, just with these round wings, really quick, rapid, snappy wing beats. Adults are reddish below and dark gray above, and adults also show this sort of hooded appearance. So a dark cap with a dark nape fading down into a dark back, all sort of connected by this dark gray color. If you get a nice up close view, they have sort of these big buggy eyes compared to a Cooper's Hawk. And juveniles look completely different. Juveniles look like this. So nice and streaky below, warm brown above. But again, you're looking for that overall shape with a big buggy eye, relatively small head, really very, very, very dainty little hawk. Soaring, very small head, very rounded wings. And one thing that a lot of people recommend you use to identify Sharpshin versus Cooper's Hawks is the shape of the tail in flight. So Sharpshin being a nice square tail versus Cooper's, as we'll see, has a rounded tail. I will say it's true with anything. You never want to rely on one identifying feature to say, oh, that's what that is. Because when Sharpshins are molting the outer tail feathers, it can look really rounded. And it's not always that nice and square. Also, their wings at times can appear a little bit longer. Their head can maybe look a little bit larger. So really you want to build a case for any species using a combination of field marks. So never rely on any one thing too heavily. But on this guy, you really can see that big buggy eye and this nice, really dark hood. And compare that with the Cooper's Hawk, much more robust, kind of barrel-chested here. Just kind of the big brother to the Sharpshin Hawk. Really common in suburban settings, and all of the accipiters are what we call the forest hawks. So really designed to be in forest habitats where they hunt birds on the wing. They use those short wings to maneuver quickly through the trees to chase down smaller birds. And compared to the Sharpshin Hawk, which I said kind of looks like it has a hood, the adult Cooper's Hawks look like they have a cap with a paler nape and then a darker back again. So the dark areas are concentrated here and here with a paler area in between. And in flight, you see a much larger head, relatively longer wings than the Sharpshin, and that rounded tail. And both the Sharpshin and the Cooper's Hawk have this white undertail area that's really clean in the adults like this and in juveniles like that. And our last accipiter, largest of them all, the northern goshawk. This is truly a beast of a bird. Almost buteo size, just incredibly powerful, while the other accipiters, the Sharpshin and the Coopers, are out hunting chickadees and sparrows. This guy will regularly take down grouse. They just don't mess around. Adults are unmistakable, this really cool gray with this little black mask, much larger proportional bill, huge talons. I mean, they're just really incredible birds. And on top of that, they're a lot less common and a lot more exciting to see than the other two. So all these things combined kind of make them just a really awe-inspiring experience anytime you get lucky enough to encounter one. So here you see the juvenile, just a tank of a bird. And one thing that they have, that if you see them flying from a distance, that can help you separate this from a Cooper's hawk, is this streaked undertail. So where the Cooper's hawk had this nice bright white undertail, the goshawk has streaks underneath the tail. And soaring almost has more of a Sharpshin shape to the tail, but just a huge body, much longer, broader wings, just a huge, incredibly powerful bird. In this photo, he was chasing down a white-winged dove, which he inevitably caught. And our next group are the buteos, with one little caveat here that we'll get to later. So starting off with probably the most iconic classic hawk in the US, perhaps, the red-tailed hawk. And I think it's kind of funny how well-known red-tailed hawks are even among non-birders, but they're really one of the most complicated and interesting and intricate bird or raptors that we have. You could do a week-long course on red-tailed hawk identification. They're just really so diverse. You might think, oh, it's a red-tailed hawk. I know how to identify it because it's the one with the red tail. Well, only some adults have red tails. No juveniles have red tails, and not even all adult red-tailed hawks have red tails. The one thing, probably the easiest identifying feature on red-tailed hawks is the patagial mark right here. This dark area at the leading edge of the wing between the wrist and the body. Pretty consistently across most subspecies, you will see this dark area here in flight. Other ID features in a general sense, generally they have dark heads. Generally you'll see a belly band. Always they have these nice broad wings bulging here in the secondaries. But they're very common habitat generalists, and a partial migrant. So we will see an uptick in numbers in the winter, but there are some around year round. So here's a collage of what I would call typical red-tailed hawks. You see that nice dark patagial here. Even on this weird angle, you still see that dark patagial here. You even see some of the red peeking through. On these juveniles, you see a nice belly band here. Another identifying point on the red-tailed hawks are these white scapulars that kind of form a V from the back. You kind of see that white scapular V there. Of course, you see that glaring red tail. Again, the patagial here. Really clear-cut red-tailed hawks. Then you get guys like this. This is an adult red-tailed hawk. It doesn't have a red tail. It doesn't have clear patagial marks. It's dark all over with a white tail. This is an adult Harlan's subspecies of red-tailed hawk. This is also a Harlan's red-tailed hawk. It doesn't even have the white V on the scapulars. This is a Kreider's red-tailed hawk, has a white head, almost no belly band or patagial marks. This one is just a really heavily marked juvenile with a belly band that goes all the way to the undertail and markings up the breast. So they're complicated. The more you study them where you clearly can tell what it is, the better you'll be able to tell when you see one with weird plumage. Getting to know that structure really, really well will help you identify them no matter what they look like. All right, up next we have the Swainson's hawk, which is a lot. In contrast, is much clearer identification in my mind. Long pointed wings, which help them make that really incredibly long migration that we looked at earlier. We have two morphs with intermediate morphs in between, a light morph and a dark morph. This is a really beautiful light morph here with this dark bib. All Swainson's hawks have these long pointed wings with this dark, not even just the trailing edge, but all these flight feathers are dark, which creates this sort of dark back half to the wings. Really preferring open grasslands or agricultural areas, and they are a summer resident in the US. And oftentimes, I have this sort of note down here, you'll see them in migration. If you get out early in the morning, you may come across a field that's just littered with hundreds of Swainson's hawks just sitting in the field, waiting for that next southward or northward push of wind to help them on their way. And here we see some diversity. Again, beautiful classic light morph here, and the sort of other extreme with the dark morph. And here's sort of an intermediate morph, still seeing that bib. Juveniles, while they don't have the bib, they still have this really long, nice pointed wing profile with this dark back half to the wings. And juveniles have a much paler face, which kind of sets them apart from other juvenile hawks in my mind. And when perched, I guess I don't really have a great photo to illustrate it. Oh, you can kind of see it down here. Typically they have wing tips that extend past the tip of the tail. So if you see it from behind, it's a great field mark. Up next we have the ferruginous hawk, one of my favorite hawks. Really robust, large, bulky, heavy looking hawk. One of only 3 species of raptor in the US with leggings, which are feathered legs all the way down to the top of the toes. Again, with 2 morphs, a light morph and a dark morph, light morph being much more common. They tend to be in open areas of grassland and are really tied to prairie dog colonies or other small mammals. They are a winter resident in southern New Mexico for the most part, with scattered breeding populations across the plains in rocky outcrops. And so here we see a nice dark morph, chocolatey all over, showing another great ID point for ferruginous hawk, which is this white panel on top of the primaries if they give you a top side view. Adults, light morphs, have this bright white tail, and you can see those red leggings forming a V on the bottom. And if you get a nice up close view, you can see this gape that goes way back and is really nice and bright, which is unlike pretty much any other hawk. Even from a distance, like on this guy, you can see that bright yellow gape going way back behind the, underneath the eye. Really cool, beautiful hawk. And next we have the zone-tailed hawk. Pretty straightforward, pretty low variability, all black hawk with bright white tail band, yellow bare parts, the legs and the sear around the bill, silvery underwings. So all of this, I mean, aside from the white band on the tail, kind of leads to a very similar profile to a turkey vulture, which they often associate with. And some people have hypothesized that they've kind of used this as camouflage, and they'll hang out with turkey vultures. And turkey vultures aren't really a threat to any living thing. So they'll kind of sneak in with the turkey vultures and swoop down on unsuspecting prey. That's sort of a hypothesis. I don't know if that's really been studied or not. Habitat preference in southern New Mexico tends to be dry ponderosa forest with sort of rocky outcrops. In other areas of their range, they like riparian corridors along rivers and streams. I don't know how much they use that in southern New Mexico. Maybe someone can chime in and let me know. But typically a summer resident migrating south for winter. And here we see them from a few other angles. Another thing that sets them apart from the turkey vulture, besides the white band on the tail, is this dark trailing edge to the wings that turkey vultures do not have, besides, of course, the feathered head. And here we see a juvenile, which does not have that white band on the tail, but again, all black, silvery wing linings, shape of the wings, everything tells us it's a zone-tailed hawk. And our last buteo is not a buteo at all. It is under a different genus called Buteo gallus, but it is buteo enough alike that I have lumped it in with the rest for this presentation. And that is the common black hawk. Again, all dark hawk with a white tailband with yellow bare parts. You'd think, oh, you know, that looks pretty similar to the zone-tailed hawk. How am I going to tell him apart? Well, look at that shape. When he's flying, those are just big old paddle wings, totally unlike anything else that we have. And a really, really short tail. It almost looks like it has no tail at all. This white band really lines up with the trailing edge of the wing. And see these nice long trailing legs. If you get a good view like this, you can see those longer legs than the zone-tailed hawk. And the habitat preference for these guys is strictly riparian, or areas around water, where they hunt for things like crawfish, frogs, snakes, and other things that live around the water, occasionally fish. Juveniles are markedly different, very streaky, very pale around the face, but shape is very similar to the adults, just totally unmistakable there. And our last little group are the eagles and others. So golden eagle, bald eagle, osprey, northern harrier, and turkey vulture. So first up is the golden eagle. So this is just an incredibly massive, powerful, impressive, awe-inspiring, all of the adjectives bird. I think they're just so incredible. In fact, I had the coolest experience seeing them super up close with Megan one time down there south of Silver City. But generally, they are warm brown overall with this bright golden nape that's obvious even from a distance, and proportionally a really tiny head. So look at how huge these wings are in flight with this kind of dinky looking head. Again, this is one of our other raptors with feathered legs that go all the way down to the top of the toes, but if you are close enough to see the feathers going all the way down to the top of the toes, you are an incredibly lucky human being. These are pretty skittish raptors as well. Juveniles will have varying amounts of white at the base of the flight feathers here and at the base of the tail, which I'll illustrate in the next slide. Habitat preference is typically in drier areas, so plains, grasslands, particularly areas with rocky outcrops, or anywhere in the mountains. And here we see a nice crisp juvenile here with these white at the base of the flight feathers and around the base of the tail. And here we see a couple of perched birds, just huge hulking massing profiles, just incredibly, barrel shaped. And here is one soaring up into flight. And I just wanted to illustrate another, again, how you don't want to rely too heavily on one ID point, because, I'll just stay here. Here you see a wing shape that's flat in the front and relatively flat, but bulging here in the secondaries, which in a lot of raptor books will tell you to look for that for golden eagle. Long wings with a slight bulge at the trailing edge. But look down here, you see a bow at the front of the wing and a relatively straight trailing edge. This bird was flying into an incredibly strong headwind, which didn't seem to phase it at all. It was blowing snow and everything else, and it just was cruising along like it was just totally unfazed. It was incredible to watch. But just to illustrate how wing shape and posture and things can change depending on what the raptor is experiencing, or any bird for that matter. Just to kind of hammer home, never rely on one identifying point too heavily. Make a case for every bird. Up next, we have the bald eagle. Everybody knows the adult bald eagle, fairly obvious. You can tell a bald eagle from miles away. That white head and tail just stands out like a sore thumb. Where it gets tricky is with juvenile birds. A lot of people can confuse them with golden eagles, as they're mostly brown all over with variable amounts of white patches. And as far as habitat preference goes, bald eagles tend to prefer areas with water, but in migration, they may use ridge tops for that updraft of wind to help them on their way, and they'll also take advantage of roadkill So you can experience them in a wide variety of habitats, but they tend to prefer waterways or lakes. And so let's look at some juvenile birds here. So we have 3 adults and 2 juveniles here. This is likely a third-year bird, lots of white speckling underneath, but lots of brown speckling as well. But you see this big bill, a relatively larger head than the golden eagle, and the golden eagle will never show this much white across the belly, across the armpits of the wing. Down here you see one that may be even more confusing for a golden eagle. But again, you see this larger head, larger bill, and the white is in the wrong place. White here in the armpit, white speckling across the belly, not something that you're likely to see in a golden eagle. Golden eagle will have white here at the base of the primaries. And here we see 2 at a distance, a nice adult here, and probably a 3rd or 4th year bird here, with speckling all across the belly, around the wings, and really broad, kind of rectangular wings. Just pretty massive birds. And also here on this bird, demonstrating something we see with both golden and bald eagles, these extended primaries that we call sort of fingers. We see on a lot of larger raptors. Up next, we have the osprey, the fish-eating raptor, almost exclusively eating a fish-based diet, which means that you can almost always count on finding them near water. However, in migration, you may encounter them soaring overhead over any kind of habitat. In fact, I've seen them resting on a telephone pole in the middle of the plains in eastern New Mexico, totally, hundreds of miles away from water. So they make their way long distances, so you may run into them anywhere, but typically you see them along rivers or lakes. They often hold their wings in this sort of M pattern, with their wrists pulled forward, lots of paleness, whiteness below with these dark wrists and dark wingtips, and this black mask on a relatively small head. Here we see a couple of perched birds. From behind, you see almost an entirely black looking bird, but you see that mostly white head with a clean black mask. Again, from the side, that white head with the black mask, pretty obvious. And of course, classic, carrying his little fish for dinner. This one is half eaten, but they have little hooks on the inside of their feet that help them grab onto slippery fish like this. And they almost always orient the fish head first, kind of, I think it's sort of an aerodynamics thing, so it makes it a little bit easier for them to fly off with. All right, and up next we have our northern harrier, almost exclusively using open areas of grassland where they forage by flying low over the grass and listening for their prey below. The adult males are often called the gray ghosts for this really smooth, beautiful gray plumage with these black wingtips, whereas females and juveniles are much more brown and streaked, which we'll see in the next slide. And they have these facial discs like owls that help them really hone in on where mammals and things are scurrying below them so they can find that prey in all that grass. They have a bright white rump, which is a great ID point for them when you pair it with their behavior of gliding low over the grass. Really wobbly in flight, kind of teetering around, moving their head around, listening for that prey. And they are a winter resident here. So here we see some diversity in plumages. Nice adult male here, really clean gray, possibly an adult female here, lots of streaking below, and you see that sort of facial disc here. And on both of these, you can see that bright white rump that's very obvious from any distance as they're moving over the grass. Here, just sort of illustrating that classic style, head face down, wings kind of a kilter as they move around over the grassland. And here's just a nice close-up showing you that beautiful facial disc, kind of like an owl. And this is kind of an extremely colorful juvenile bird here with lots of orange tones underneath. Just showing you some of the variability in color from this to this. It's just totally different color scheme. So it's where you really want to rely more heavily on behavior and shape versus color. In our last sort of raptor, in quotation marks, honorary raptor perhaps, depending on your definition of what a raptor is, which I won't get into because it can be controversial, is the turkey vulture. I think it's important to go over him really quickly because they are so common in the summer and in migration that a lot of people can confuse them for a hawk or an eagle. But they are all black typically. They have a very small featherless head, red on adults, gray on juveniles, silvery underwings, a really wedge-shaped tail, and when they're soaring or flying around, they have this really teetering flight. It's really unsteady, and it's really, really unique. There's not a lot of raptors that have that sort of teetering side-to-side style of flight. Habitat, they're a generalist. Anywhere there's dead things, you might find a turkey vulture. And an interesting thing about them is they're one of the few, vultures are one of the few birds in the world that have a sense of smell. And this is a really young juvenile here with all this white fluffy down still on him. They had a nest inside this abandoned building. And here's a more classic looking turkey vulture that's silvery underneath the flight feathers on an all black body. With that, again, that bright red head with this sort of ivory colored bill, obvious even from a distance. And here's a great big group of them sort of soaring way up high. When they're up high like this, you sort of lose that silvery lining to the wings, but these big broad wings with this wedge-shaped tail. And I mean, they all just look decapitated. There's like nothing there on the front. But we have one little token guy over here for any of you experts. It's a black vulture. I took this photo in South Texas, so he's just sneaking in there. And that concludes our section on sort of species profiles. And now I want to talk a little bit about having success going out and actually finding these guys. So before you go out, it's important that you do your research. And I will say that this presentation does not count as doing your research because there is so much that I could not go into. I'm already at like 40 minutes here and we just barely scratched the surface. So where you want to start is going to your field guide. Your Nat Geo guide or your Sibley guide is a great place to start. But I recommend, if you're wanting to get a little bit more into it, these two books are great. Hawks from Every Angle, Hawks from a Distance, both by Jerry Liguori, one of the leading raptor experts in the US. There's also a book called Raptors of New Mexico, which I have, my laptop is sitting on it right now, but it's like a textbook. It's, you know, like 2 inches thick. And if you want to know anything about raptors in New Mexico, it's in that book, I guarantee you. But one thing I want all of you to do tonight is go download the Raptor ID app by Hawkwatch International. It is this one. It looks like that. It's in the App Store. It's free. It is incredible. It has videos of raptors flying around that are narrated, telling you exactly what to look for. It has, you know, species profiles telling you where they migrate to, where they migrate from, what habitat they prefer, what they eat, what their nest looks like. Just everything you ever wanted to know about raptors is in this app, and it's free, which is incredible. Also, I recommend going to hawkwatch.org if you want to learn more about anything about raptors, migration, you know, what wind direction is best to go out and look for migrating raptors, anything like that. That's a great resource. And of course, ebird.org. If you're not using eBird, go start using eBird. It tells you what's been seen in your neighborhood. It tells you what was seen in your neighborhood 5 years ago. They're doing all sorts of incredible work with their data, showing, I mean, those maps I showed you earlier were based on eBird data. Just the most up-to-date information is going to be right there for going out and finding raptors. And once you are armed with all of that knowledge on habitat, behavior, seasonal distribution, and similar species. Oh, I want to talk about similar species real quick. Like we mentioned several times throughout this talk, you want to make sure you know what you're looking for between different species. So you may see, okay, zone-tailed hawk, he's black all over and he's got a white band on the tail. Well, if you don't look at what's similar, like the common black hawk, you might have a tough time on your hands making sure you know exactly what the differences are between those two. But anyway, once you've got all of these things down, you've written all your notes, you've done all your research, you're ready to go outside, what are you going to do? Well, there's a couple of different techniques, and for me it depends on the time of year. So in migration, I will often recommend a hawk watch style, so finding a place often along a ridge where you can sit and watch for hawks migrating over. Or in the wintertime, I often myself will go out and cover as much ground as possible. So most of the time, the species I'm looking for are grassland species when I'm doing this. So driving county roads and just scanning telephone poles, scanning fence lines, just covering as much ground as possible. And when you come across a bird, you want to take notes, note what it's doing, note any ID features you see. Does it have a belly band? Does it have long pointed wings or short rounded wings? Does it have a long tail or a short tail? Is the tail banded? All those sorts of things. And you want to take photos or draw sketches, whatever you're more comfortable with. And just always know that there's always exceptions to the rules. Nothing is hard and fast. Things can appear different based on the conditions outside, the individual bird. So never hold on to one thing too dearly. You want to, anytime you come across your common species like your red-tailed hawk perhaps, take the time to study it. Even though you've maybe seen 100 red-tailed hawks this week, sit there and really think, you know, what makes this a red-tailed hawk? If I took away all the field marks on this bird, what makes this a red-tailed hawk still? And the better you have that sort of intimate relationship with these birds, the better you're going to be able to make a snap ID at any time, in any plumage, in any condition. But that being said, not every bird's going to be able to be identified. I've been standing on the Corpus Christi Hawk Watch on the coast of Texas, which is one of the most, productive and renowned hawk watch sites in the world, and been standing next to some of the best hawk watchers in the world, counting raptors, and seeing them say, that's just a raptor species, we don't know what that is. And for them, that means that the bird was about 10 miles away, flying away from them, and it was a speck of black in the sky for me. But even they have instances where you just can't identify everything, and that's okay. You just have to be comfortable with that, just as a birder in general. And just kind of circling back here to taking photos, as far as identifying your birds, it's a really great tool, in my opinion, and it's something I've used in the past. And here's a beautiful photo I took of a blob on top of a stick. But even though it's just a blob on top of a stick, I can still identify this bird. This was taken in South Texas. It has a pale gray head, dark gray on the top side. And here we see one clear white band through the tail and a black terminal band on the tail, and a little bit of white underneath. A big, broad sort of posture with a relatively short tail. And that was enough to tell me that this was my lifer gray hawk. Later on, I'd see them a lot better than that. And this is also a species that's found in southern New Mexico, but since they're kind of restricted to just a couple canyons way down south in the Boot Heel, I left his species account off for the sake of time. But I just think they're incredibly gorgeous, so I had to stick them in there somehow. And so just for a review, we have our Buteos, big strong wings, relatively large heads. Our eagles, great big long wings, relatively small heads. Our harrier with nice long narrow wings, long narrow tail. Accipiter with relatively short rounded wings, small head, long tail. Our falcon with long pointed wings, very sleek profile. Osprey often holding his wings in this M pattern. And the turkey vulture with big broad wings and a little tiny head and a sort of wedge-shaped tail. And that's it. I'm going to leave you with this little puzzle here at the end of these two silhouettes. And if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to attempt to answer them.
Thanks so much, Brian. That was amazing. We loved it. And those photos, I mean, I didn't even mention it, but he's such a good photographer too, that I knew that watching one of his presentations was going to be great. Well, if anybody has any questions, they can either type it in or you can unmute yourself and ask it that way. I'm trying to study those silhouettes.
It's a tricky one. This guy's in a really strange posture here.
Yeah. Well, I really like that. I like that you point out that you can't always ID a bird. You got to be willing to let it go sometimes and not give a false ID, because it does get super tricky. And I think that does make a good birder, being able to say when and that thing is too far, I can't do it.
Absolutely. I do it all the time. I would rather put down Buteo species instead of trying to narrow it down to one thing if I can't do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you see like people at the top of their, field do that too, it's inspiring. But.
Absolutely.
I'd like to ask, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure. Go for it, Andy.
You said it was controversial, but I'd like to know why the turkey vulture is categorized as a raptor.
It just depends on who you ask. I don't think there's a really hard and fast rule for what defines a raptor. Some people say that owls are raptors. Some people say that they're not. Some people say that all the vultures are raptors. Some people say that they're not. I'm not sure exactly if there's a scientific definition for a raptor. But to me, I don't know. I'm kind of undecided personally if I would include them or not.
Yeah.
But I felt for the purposes of this presentation, it was really important to include them just because they can be tricky for identification.
Yeah. Well, that was very good. It was great. It was a great presentation. But why didn't you put owls in your presentation?
Because then we'd be here for about 5 hours.
That's a good reason.
And stay tuned for owls in December.
Thank you, Brian. That was great.
Of course. Thank you.
Well, I have a question. I always wonder about climate change and range expansion. What of these species do you think we'll see a change in? Or which one do you think could be the most susceptible?
That's a great question. So immediately I think to species that breed in the high Arctic. So like our golden eagle, our falcons, probably our rough-legged hawk, which I didn't include here. Yeah. Those come to mind first, just due to their breeding range.
Yeah.
But I'll have to think about that.
That's probably a good bet, I think.
Yeah.
We are starting to see zone-tailed hawks later into the season. Like I think last year we had 1 or 2 in November, and I had another one in December. And so that's one to keep an eye out. Like, is it warm enough for them to stick around? You know, and that's going the other way, the southern, those.
Right. No, absolutely. That's a great example. Back where I grew up in Southwest Texas, zone-tailed hawks used to be strictly summer resident and pretty strictly up in the hills. But now we're seeing them wintering in pretty good numbers. So it's really just been a change within my lifetime. So
yeah. Definitely seems like it's happening quickly.
Yep.
Anybody else? Lots of people saying they enjoyed it, Bryan.
Oh, great. I was happy to do it for you guys.
Okay, tell us the silhouette.
Okay, I'll give it away. So
or
here,
unless somebody wants to guess. Oh, here, somebody guessed.
Okay.
Jim and Jackie say, is it a golden eagle and a prairie falcon?
That's a great guess. Anybody else want to take a stab?
Osprey.
Osprey, okay.
Osprey.
Okay. Anybody want to hear the answer, or anyone want to guess again? Okay.
Let's do it. Oh, wait, what, Eleanor? Okay, go.
Okay. So here we see a bird in a really bizarre posture. And here we see a bird chasing that bird. So we'll start with this bird over here. We see pretty broad, but very pointed wings, relatively long tail. And just, we see it chasing this bird over here, which is a pretty bold move given their two sizes. So this guy is pretty brave. And here we see a guy with sort of a rounded, sort of wedge-shaped tail and this really thin, dinky little head. This is not the bill, this is the whole head. And so up front here with these big broad wings that are kind of folded in as he's pumping his wings as fast as he can go is a turkey vulture being chased by a peregrine falcon for no apparent reason. I mean, the peregrine was not nesting in this area. The turkey vulture just got a little too close, and the peregrine said, that's enough. Time to move on your way, even though this guy poses no threat. That's just kind of the attitude peregrine falcons have.
Wow.
Yep.
That turkey vulture is in a bizarre position. That's a hard one.
Yeah, it's really tricky. And that's just kind of, again, to illustrate, whoever said osprey, that's pretty a good guess here with these sort of M-shaped wings. But yeah, he was just booking it. So again, don't ever rely on one ID point too heavily.
Well, Bryan, I know you've done some birding festivals in the past. Are you gonna, whenever those return, are we gonna be able to see you again at, say, Festival of the Cranes or?
Yep, absolutely. I'll be at Festival of the Cranes as soon as they are able to hold it again. I do all sorts of private guiding all across the US. If you have any interest in birding anywhere, I'd be happy to talk to you about what you're interested in. I also guide at the Rio Grande Valley Birding Festival in South Texas. I also guide at the Birding the Border Festival in Southwest Texas around the Del Rio area. So I'm kind of all over the place. Yeah, you might run into me anywhere.
That's great. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Bryan. I think that'll do it for tonight, but everybody really enjoyed that.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks everybody for coming. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.